Good evening. Welcome to Reading Grounds. It is March 24th, 2019. Sunday, of course. Let's see what's on the front page of Wikipedia tonight. Today's featured article is Project E. Project E was a Cold War arrangement under which the United States provided the United Kingdom with nuclear weapons for the Royal Air Force. It was later expanded to provide warheads to the British Army, and there was a maritime version known as Project N that provided nuclear depth bombs. In the news, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant loses its last territory in Syria following a defeat by the Syrian Democratic Forces and the US-led coalition. Nursultan Nazarbayev resigns as president of Kazakhstan after a 29-year tenure, appointing Kasim Jomart Tokayev as interim president. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing those names, but, I don't speak the language and I'm not at all familiar with it. On this day, considered March 25th by Wikipedia's time frame, it is Bengali Genocide Remembrance Day. On this day in 1410, the Yongle Emperor of Ming Dynasty China launched the first of his military campaigns against the Mongols, resulting in the fall of the Mongol Khan Bonyashiri. In 1655, Dutch astronomer Christian Huygens, again, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but he discovered Titan, the largest natural satellite of the planet Saturn. In 1807, the Slave Trade Act became law, abolishing the slave trade in the British Empire. In 1949, the Soviet Union began mass deportations of more than 90,000 people from the Baltic states to Siberia. On this day in 1975, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia was shot and killed by his nephew, Faisal bin Musaid. A lot of going-ons on this day in history. Or I guess, based on my own time frame, that would be tomorrow. Tyler, thanks for coming in, of course, and thanks for being here and being so punctual. Hello, Shelby. Thank you for coming on. Nice to have everyone back. Last time we talked, we focused entirely on J.R.R. Tolkien and one of the chapters from The Hobbit, which was Riddles in the Dark, which is a lot of fun to read, and definitely one of the better ones. And hello to Kimmery, even though she's not saying hello back. We'll forgive her this time. Anyways, last time we talked about Riddles in the Dark. I ruined my voice by trying to do my Gollum impersonation. I had mentioned at the end of the stream last week about a letter Tolkien wrote to Nazi Germany, because around the time that Lord of the Rings got published and it was being well liked was around the time the Third Reich started taking hold, and German publishers were interested in publishing the Lord of the Rings, but they sent him a letter and they asked him if he had any Jewish ancestry that he was aware of. Tolkien was so incensed by this that he wrote a letter and he completely bashed the question. He turned it on the publisher. I'm not really sure what the phrasing would be. I want to say Philippics, but I think that might be a little more specific than what I had in mind. Either way, he wrote a very incensed letter. But then he calmed down a little bit and he wrote a second letter to the same publisher before sending the first one, and it was a much more professional, much more level-headed, I guess you might say. And he gave both letters to his editor or his publisher or one of the two, and he said, you can send whichever one you think is best. Ultimately, his editor chose the more professional one because you don't want to antagonize people unless you have to. Um, but the ironic thing was that during the war, this calm letter was the one that was destroyed in the war itself. The angry letter, however, was preserved because it stayed in his native England. And so between the two, only the letter that wasn't actually sent is the one that we know about, is the one that we can read. Um, and so I talked about reading it in retrospect, or last week, I should say. Um, and I Googled it before coming on the stream, and I think I have found it. Let's see here. It's actually shorter than I thought it was, but we'll take a read of it anyway. It's dated the 25th of July, 1938. And it begins, Dear Sirs, thank you for your letter. Thank you for your letter. I regret that I am not clear as to what you intend by Arish. Of course, I am not of Aryan extraction. That is Indo-Iranian. As far as I am aware, none of my ancestors spoke Hindustani, Persian, Gypsy, or any related dialects. But if I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am Jewish or of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. My great-great-grandfather came to England in the 18th century from Germany. The main part of my descent is therefore purely English, and I am an English subject, which should be sufficient. I have been accustomed, nonetheless, to regard my German name with pride, and continue to do so throughout the period of the late regrettable war, in which I served in the English army. I cannot, however, forbear to comment that if impertinent and irrelevant inquiries of this sort are to become the rule in matters of literature, then the time is not far distant when a German name will no longer be a source of pride. Your enquiry is doubtless made in order to comply with the laws of your own country, but that this should be held to apply unto the subjects of another state would be improper, even if it had, as it has not, any bearing whatsoever on the merits of my work or its sustainability for publication, of which you appear to have satisfied yourselves without reference to my Abendstammung, which I assume is a German word. I trust you will find this reply satisfactory and remain yours faithfully, J.R.R. Tolkien. So, of course, there's a lot of white pride when people say that they're of Aryan descent. But the meaning, as Tolkien points out, has been lost. People are not actually Arish when they claim they are because they're not Indo-Iranian. Some of the filthy races, quote unquote, that they consider to be less than human, such as the Persians, the Gypsies, or Hindustanis, those would be the people that, in an academic sense, would be referred to as Aryan, not necessarily the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans. That is a good example of cultural appropriation, which people throw around a lot in accusation that if you display any part of your or of another culture that isn't yours, they consider you to be culturally appropriating. Some people get mad when somebody who isn't of East Asian celebrates the Lunar New Year, Chinese New Year, of course. Some people get mad basically over anything these days, but I believe that a lot of people misuse the word appropriation, which ironically has a tendency to appropriate or misappropriate the exact definition of racism and erasure. Because the idea behind cultural appropriation is that you steal something from another culture and then claim that it was your own. In this case, as Tolkien kind of points out, the Aryans were not, in fact, what you would consider to be German people. They were more Near Eastern, or as the British would say, they are from the Orient, which in England bears reference to India and those countries that surround India. here in the United States, Orient refers to more of East Asia, like Japan, China, and such. But it may also be worth noting that Tolkien says that he regrets that he is not Jewish, at least that he has no ancestry of Jewish people. Tolkien himself was a Catholic, of course, and very devout. But it's interesting to note that he says that he kind of wishes he was Jewish, because at the time, anti-Semitism was very common, and it wasn't necessarily so culturally taboo to be anti-Semitic until the war with Germany, the Second World War with Germany. But more than that, a lot of people, well, maybe not a lot of people, perhaps that's an exaggeration, but it's okay, Kimry. I said we forgive you. But no, thank you for coming on the stream. Your support is, of course, appreciated. Anyways, so Tolkien was sometimes accused of being anti-Semitic with his depiction of the dwarves, who are these kind of short people with beards, and they're very crafty. You know, they make all these. They have all this mysticism going about them, and they love gold and jewels and fine things, basically above all else. And so people accused it of being a Jewish stereotype. Tolkien himself didn't necessarily like allegory. I don't know if I've mentioned it on the stream. Maybe I could talk a little more in that. But essentially, the idea of Tolkien deliberately characterizing Jews as the dwarves in his story is, if there is any resemblance, it's coincidental or incidental, as it might be, because he demonstrates with this letter that he has a love for the Jewish people and their ancestry, and that he would never besmirch them, at least not on a conscious level. As I so so anyways, as far as dang it, I've lost my train of thought. As far as allegory goes, Tolkien has said that he despised allegory in storytelling, that he's despised it ever since he could detect it. An allegory is essentially, you know what, maybe I can even pull up Tolkien's exact definition for it. Here's a quote, which is by him, posted on Goodreads. It says, "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the proposed domination of the author." So what he's saying is that allegory is sort of taking a story or story elements and forcing them into a very specific, narrow definition. If you were to write a story about the Jews, but you didn't want to necessarily call them the Jews, and you called them like dwarves or whatever you decide your fantasy race is going to be, you could do that. But anyone that reads that, or most people that read it, are going to look at that and be like, well, he's just talking about the Jews, you know. And it only allows for the author's precise domination of the story to shine through. So that inevitably, if there's any disagreements with it, the author just says, no, that's not what it's meant to be. And then Tolkien says the other opposite end of that spectrum is applicability. And applicability is, by the strict definition of the word, it's to apply something. If you can take a story and you can apply it to your own life. Another great example of this from Tolkien, in fact, is It is the One Ring itself. A lot of people, because you have the One Ring, and it's this magical thing. It's this incredibly magical thing, not just a mere a mere artifact, but one that dictates the future course of the world. Such a small and important thing. It is the power and binding of the Dark Lord Sauron. It is his manifestation, and it's so powerful that its magic leaks out essentially, and uh, grants special powers to those who wield it. And Gollum, as we kind of talked about last week, Gollum himself became addicted to the ring, and he totally twisted himself from what he used to be, and he became something new. He was no longer Smeagol, he was Gollum. And he was addicted to the ring. And a lot of people, they look at the ring and they look at its addiction and its power and they say, oh, this is an allegory for the atomic bomb. Or, they say it's a matter of anything. And Tolkien right out said in a video, he said, a lot of people ask me if it's about the atomic bomb. And he says, no, it's not. The difference was that the ring, there are elements of allegory to the ring that you could apply to your own life or something like that. But the key difference is applicability. One person might read it and they might understand that the ring can represent nuclear weapons. They understand that it can symbolize nuclear weapons, and another person might look at that and instead they apply it to their own lives, applicability again, and they decide that it refers to just addiction in general, and how addiction is used by evil to enslave people and keep them under keep them dominated and controlled. And you can come up with any applicable metaphor to it. And chances are, as long as there is application to it, it's not necessarily wrong. And so that's the difference between applicability and allegory. The difference is that with applicability, you can kind of change and decide based on what you feel is right. And with allegory, the idea is that there's only really one or two strict ways to interpret it. And any wayward thing can just be easily discarded, any wayward interpretation. Another example would be the X-Men. A lot of people have talked about the X-Men in the past, and they say, oh, the X-Men, they're really a metaphor for homosexuals, because they're these people that are, kind of different, and so society shuns them, and all this stuff. And there was a line in one of the movies where the mutant's mom asks her son, she's like, have you ever tried not being a mutant? Which is, supposedly like, have you ever tried not being gay or whatever? But then other people point out, they're like, no, actually, at the time that it was written originally in the 70s or whatever it was actually about immigration. And the thing is, like, you look at that and it's like, well, it's not necessarily wrong to say that it's about, homosexuality or about immigration, because it has that sense of applicability to it. Both of those definitions do work, and it's ultimately up to you to decide. On the strictest level, you could look at X-Men and you could just say, this is a story about people who are different and how their differences make them special. And so even though society shuns them, they shouldn't, because they're special people and they're very useful. And a lot of them are good-hearted and they want to help things. And then, of course, you have the dichotomy between Xavier's mutants and then Magneto's mutants. Magneto being they're the same mutants and outcasts as Professor X, but they're different people. They're much more evil and they're wrongdoers and they're mischievous and dominable, really, because all they want to do is dominate and change things, as opposed to Professor Xavier and the School of Gifted Youngsters, or whatever they call it, who just want to make the world a better place. So that's the difference between applicability and all that stuff. Hello, Joe. Thanks for coming on the stream. Uh, I refuse to acknowledge the Eagles question because I've heard it a lot and I'm kind of sick of it. And I actually don't know enough about Tolkien to discuss it. But thank you for coming on the stream. So we were talking a little bit about J.R.R. Tolkien. I found that letter on a website called Letters of Note. I'm a little curious about it. I haven't actually read over it. I don't know if any of it is worth reading. Because if I'm being honest, I actually don't have a game plan tonight, which maybe I shouldn't admit, but well, it's too late now. Let's see. There's a sidebar here of articles most read. Let's see here. To My Old Master is the top one. Suppose we could take a look at that. No, not that one. Okay, so there's a bit of preamble here. And as I said, this is lettersofnote.com, which it looks like there's also perhaps a book published. But I'm going to... Okay, there's even an About section on the sidebar. It says, Letters of Note is an attempt to gather and sort fascinating letters, postcards, telegrams, faxes, and memos. Makes sense. Edited by Sean Usher, who also runs Lists of Note and Letterheady. And this one is Letters of Note, one called To My Old Master. And this is apparently the most read letter on this website. So let's take a little look at that. But first, let me update the stream so that people know what they're getting into. Just making sure that I didn't misspell Letters of Note because I'm very tired and a little careless. Anyways, so this is To My Old Master. In 1864, after 32 long years in the service of his master, Jordan Anderson and his wife, Amanda, escaped a life of slavery when Union Army soldiers freed them from the plantation on which they had been working so tirelessly. They grasped the opportunity with vigor, quickly moved to Ohio, where Jordan could find paid work with which to support his growing family, and didn't look back. Then, a year later, shortly after the end of the Civil War, Jordan received a desperate letter from Patrick Henry Anderson, the man who used to own him, in which he was asked to return to work on the plantation and rescue his ailing business. Jordan's reply to the person who enslaved his family, dictated from his home on August 7th, is everything you could wish for, and quite rightly was subsequently reprinted in numerous newspapers. Jordan Anderson never returned to Big Spring, Tennessee. He passed away in 1907, aged 81, and is buried alongside his wife, who died 6 years later. Together, they had a total of 11 children. This letter, along with 124 other fascinating pieces of correspondence, can be found in the best-selling book Letters of Note. So from Dayton, Ohio, August 7th, 1864, to my old master, Colonel P.H. Anderson, Big Spring, Tennessee. Sir, I got your letter, and was glad to find you had not forgotten Jordan, and that you wanted me to come back and live with you again, promising to do better for me than anybody else can. I have often felt uneasy about you. I thought the Yankees would have hung you long before this, for harboring Rebs they found at your house. I suppose they never heard about your going to Colonel Martin's to kill the Union soldier that was left by his company in their stable. Although you shot at me twice before I left you, I did not want to hear of your being hurt, and am glad you are still living. It would do me good to go back to the dear old home again, and see Miss Mary and Miss Martha and Ellen, Esther, Green, and Lee. Give my love to them all, and tell them I hope we will meet in the better world, if not in this. I would have gone back to see you all when I was working in the Nashville hospital, but one of the neighbors told me that Henry intended to shoot me if he ever got the chance. Turn it up, I guess. I'm not sure quite how, actually. my mic volume is a bit as high as I can get it, but I'll see what I can do. I don't know if that's any better. I've turned up the oh wait. Oh, that's weird. It looks like my bit rate is kind of low. I don't know how to. Oh boy, that's not great. Let's see here. YouTube is telling me that my audio current bit rate is lower than the recommended rate. I'm not sure how to fix that though, so I'm gonna have to take a look real quick. Well, that's weird. Oh, maybe my connection just freaked out for a second. Before I keep going, I need to look this up and make sure that. That's really weird. I didn't change any settings, but apparently that warning has gone away on YouTube. I wonder if my connection just went weird for a second. Does this sound any better? Post in the chat if you can hear me better now. In the meantime, I'm going to be looking at this setting and nobody's responding, so... Oh, Tyler just responded. Apparently this is better. It's very strange. I didn't change any of my settings. I don't know if my if that was just my internet connection changed. If only I knew what any of these settings meant. Audio. If anyone else can hear me, do post on the stream because I'm not sure. Tyler's saying he can hear me, but I'm not sure about anyone else. In the meantime, I'm going to keep looking at these settings real quick. Well, Kimmery and Shelby and Tyler are saying stuff now. I don't. Joe had said that he can't hear me. I'm not sure. Joe, if you can hear, post something. Otherwise, I'm not really sure what else I can do, to be honest. I don't want to mess too much with these settings that I don't understand what they are. Streaming. Joe's not posting. I don't know if he can hear. I'm going to take a look real quick and see about... the advanced settings. I don't know if I need to change anything, but... Okay. Okay. Joe can finally hear me. Okay. Shoot. I think I might just start over. Not from the very beginning, but just from the beginning of the... not just from the beginning of the letter. Kimmery's a good friend of mine, so I'll just politely ask her to maybe keep it down. Oh, what the heck? Okay, hold on a second. My guy. YouTube audio. I don't know if you guys can still hear actually, but it looks like, yeah, my audio bit rate went back down to 0 like it had said before. I don't know if audio is just cutting out or what. That's kind of a pain. Um, I'm gonna see real quick if there's something I can do about that, or let's see. YouTube. I don't even know if you guys can hear me right now. Streaming audio bitrate. Problems? Maybe it's limited? See, that's the weird thing is like when I go to the control panel for the stream, it says that it has a suggestion. It says the audio stream's current bitrate 0 is lower than the recommended bitrate, which means that for some reason YouTube is saying that my bitrate is 0. Like if it's 0, that means there's like no audio coming through. But I don't know. That warning comes up and then it disappears. But yes, thanks. Hello, Hannah. Thanks for coming on the stream. Sorry you're so shy. I'm gonna look real quick before I go on. I don't know. Maybe there's something I need to do. Some people do get warnings. Some people do get warnings about some people get warnings about the bitrate being too high, which is not the warning I'm getting. So I don't know if I would imagine it's just something to do with the streaming quality. Like the router or something. In which case, I can't do anything about that because it's not actually my router, and I wouldn't know the first thing anyway. So we're just gonna hope that this works out. It seems like for the most part it's doing well. If it doesn't work, we'll just um, keep hoping that YouTube does well. I mean, what else can you do? Anyways, I'm gonna start the letter from the beginning. I'm going to start from the first paragraph. I won't go with any of the intro or the preamble. Anyways, sir, I got your letter and was glad to find that you had not forgotten Jordan and that you wanted me to come back and live with you again, promising to do better for me than anybody else can. I have often felt uneasy about you. I thought the Yankees would have hung you long before this for harboring Rebs they found at your house. I suppose they never heard about your going to Colonel Martin's to kill the Union soldier that was left by his company in their stable. Although you shot at me twice before I left you, I did not want to hear of your being hurt, and am glad you are still living. It would do me good to go back to the dear old home again, and see Miss Mary and Miss Martha, and Alan and Esther, Green and Lee. Give my love to them all, and tell them I hope we will meet in the better world, if not in this. I would have gone back to see you all when I was working in the Nashville hospital, but one of the neighbors told me that Henry intended to shoot me if he ever got a chance. I want to know particularly what the good chance is you propose to give me. I am doing tolerably well here. I get $25 a month, with victuals and clothing, have a comfortable home for Mandy, the folks call her Mrs. Anderson, and the children, Millie, Jane, and Grundy, go to school and are learning well. The teacher says Grundy has a head for a preacher. They go to Sunday school, and Mandy and me attend church regularly. We are kindly treated. Sometimes we overhear others saying, "Them colored people were slaves," down in Tennessee. The children feel hurt when they hear such remarks, but I tell them it was no disgrace in Tennessee to belong to Colonel Anderson. Many darkies would have been proud, as I used to be, to call you master. Now if you will write and say what wages you will give me, I will be better able to decide whether it would be to my advantage to move back again. As to my freedom, which you say I can have, there is nothing to be gained on that score, as I got my free papers in 1864 from the Provost Marshal General of the Department of Nashville. Mandy says she would be afraid to go back without some proof that you were disposed to treat us justly and kindly, and we have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you. This will make us forget and forgive old scores, and rely on your justice and friendship in the future. I served you faithfully for 32 years, and Mandy 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor's visits to me, and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money to Adams Express, in care of V. Winters, Esquire, Dayton, Ohio. If you fail to pay us for faithful labors in the past, we can have little faith in your promises in the future. We trust the good Maker has opened your eyes to the wrongs which you and your fathers have done to me and my fathers, in making us toil for you for generations without recompense. Here I draw my wages every Saturday night, but in Tennessee there was never any payday for the Negroes, any more for the horses and cows. Surely there will be a day of reckoning for those who defraud the laborer of his hire. In answering this letter, please state if there would be any safety for my Millie and Jane, who are now grown up, and both good-looking girls. You know how it is with poor Matilda and Catherine. I would rather stay here and starve, and die if it came to that, than have my girls brought to shame by the violence and wickedness of their young masters. You will also please state if there have been any schools open for the colored children in your neighborhood. The great desire of my life is to now give my children an education and have them form virtuous habits. Say howdy to George Carter, and thank him for taking the pistol from you when you were shooting at me. From your humble servant, Jordan Anderson. So that's the letter. I kind of hesitate to read a lot of social commentary on this, just because I feel like that's not a subject I'm particularly good at. Because I mean, what more can you say? You'd feel like kind of an idiot for saying, yeah, slavery is bad. I'll say that Jordan Anderson seemed very magnanimous. If the letter is an actual indication of his character, he was probably very peaceable about the whole situation, when he could have been very uptight or angry about it, which is incredible, all things considered. Kind of reminds me of Machiavelli a little bit. Just because Machiavelli was with his writing The Prince, which maybe we could even look at some point. He was it seemed like he was sort of extending an olive branch to the people who imprisoned him, but then a careful reading reveals that it's like just this very sarcastic satire. But anyways, that's some pretty serious stuff for a stream that is a lot of fairy tales and folklore and fantasy fiction. Joe is asking us in the chat if I could read a good novel like 50 Shades of Grey. He says that it is. He hears it is not just about sex, but actually has a deep story. Yeah, I bet it is quite deep. I bet it was about 6 inches deep, in fact. But we're not going to read that on this stream. For one thing, I don't want to read a whole book because I'm worried about copyright, and I don't want I don't want to read an entire book and then they're like, well, you can't do that. That's a book. It'd be one thing to just read like one chapter and talk about it. But I don't know about 50 Shades of Grey. I have a pretty low tolerance for pornography, believe it or not. And so I don't have a lot of tolerance for it. And this is meant to be a mostly family friendly stream. There are exceptions, but not not everything. But anyways, so that's That's kind of why I don't want to read like heavy social commentary on this stuff, because this stream's not supposed to be heavy. It's supposed to be quite light. There's nothing wrong with it, of course, but stuff about like slavery, it's a big subject, and but anyways, there is one here called "My Name is David Jones." Oh, it's apparently a letter from David Bowie, whose real name was David Jones. I was wondering about reading it just because I have a friend named David Jones, actually. Haven't seen him in a while because he got married. Which kind of like, I don't mean to rag on the guy, but it did surprise me just because he's a very quiet guy, very shy, very handsome, of course, very smart, but he was very reticent, and so I kind of wondered, like, I was a little surprised. Not that it was any of my business, but good for him, of course. He's doing better than I am in that department. But let me see what this letter is about. David Bowie was just 20 years of age. He had to make a dent in the music scene when he received his first piece of fan mail. Recently given up her, she wrote him a letter, told him that the music was that. Well, yeah, David Jones from the YSA. Yeah, he got married a few months back, actually. Kind of seemed to come out of nowhere, honestly. I didn't find out until after he was married. Yeah, to I met her because they came in together to the place I work. I recognized him, so I went and said hi, and I thought it was like his sister at first. But yeah, no, she's a pretty lady, and out of nowhere they just kind of got married. But that was a few months back, maybe even last year. He was actually my ministering brother. He was the guy that ministered to me, and he was a lot more consistent than the guys I've had since, unfortunately. But let's see here. I'm trying to decide if I have anything on hand that I want to read. I did look back over Bullfinch's mythology before we started. I don't want to. I don't want to rag on David Jones, because he, like I said, he is a cool dude. So I don't want to sit here and just rag on him, especially because most of the people in chat don't know who he is. But yeah, just out of nowhere, they're like, well, you're not wrong, Hannah. You're not wrong. I think I might actually take a quick break. I've only been streaming about for 45 minutes, but I think I'm going to take a break just because I want to look over things and see if I can find something to read real quick. Because I thought that letter from J.R.R. Tolkien, I thought that was much longer. And it turns out it's not. It was just a couple paragraphs, which is kind of a shame. I was under the impression that it was just this diatribe. Dang it. You know what? That's the word I was looking for. Diatribe. So I'll be right back. Just going to take a quick break. We'll see what we're going to do after the fact. Stay tuned. Okay. Before I go on, I do want to make, I do want to say one thing in defense of, uh, in defense of David Jones, because Hannah's saying that a lot of young people, young Mormons, get married just because they want to have sex. I'll say this in defense of David Jones: he's not the kind of guy that would get married prematurely. If he's getting married, you know that like it's the smart decision. It's true of a lot of people. They'll get married at 18 and then they'll hate their marriage. But David, I can't see him ever doing that. Not that it's any of my business, of course, but you know, I gotta stick up for the guy. He's too cool to just let it slide. Anyways, so I have here a book called The Book of Virtues by William Bennett, which is kind of BS that he put his name on it because I think most of it is actually stuff by other authors. I think. Yeah, like there's a letter here from F. Scott Fitzgerald to his daughter, and then there's all these other stuff that is written by other people. So the fact that his name is on the spine and that it's in big bold letters when it's mostly other people's work kind of makes me wonder. Maybe he wrote this stuff in between. I don't know. I haven't actually sat down and read this book. I actually got this years and years ago from the family business. We used to have in our family park, we had a library for the residents. And sometimes I'd go in there and read. Very rarely, because I was usually in the office. But if I was trying to avoid somebody in the office, I was usually in the library or in the bathroom or anywhere else. Anyways, this book, the reason I mention that is because that's where I got this book. I stole it. I stole it from the library. I stole a book of virtues from my family library. Well, my family business's library. And I was looking at it because when realizing that there's different authors than the one tells me that there's like a lot of tells me that there's a lot of short stories in here. And for some reason, the front of the book, the table of contents doesn't list like the authors or anything like that. But if you go into the back in the index, it'll list authors and where they are. And I mentioned that I was reading Thomas Bulfinch a little in preparation for the stream, just to prepare my voice and warm up. And looking in the very back, sure enough, there's a few entries on Thomas Bulfinch that I'd like to read. I don't know if I'll read them themselves, but I definitely want to take a look at them. So before I begin, let me fix this again. If I can spell virtues right. But this is a big book. This is 800 pages. It's not pure prose. Like it's not just straight paragraphs of text. There's a lot of different. There's a lot of variety in here and poetry and like line breaks and what have you. But let's see here. There is stuff by the Brothers Grimm, but there's also Thomas Bulfinch. First one is on page 69. Speaking of shades of gray. I've never read that book. I really don't intend to. Oh, Ozymandias is in here. I love Ozymandias. I think I've already read it on the stream, though, so I don't know if I'm going to do that. So each chapter of the Book of Virtues is based on a virtue. Let me list them in order real quick. There's self-discipline. That's the first one. compassion, responsibility, friendship, work, courage, perseverance, honesty, loyalty, faith, and acknowledgments, by which I mean the acknowledgments of the book. So in self-discipline, there's a little thing adapted from Thomas Bulfinch called phaeton. Oh man, that is actually considerably longer than I thought it would be. Man, we're just hitting home runs tonight, folks. All right. There's another one here. This one's in compassion. This one's shorter, so I'm going to read this one. It's called Echo and Narcissus. In Greek mythology, Narcissus was a beautiful youth, the son of the river god Cephisus, I think? Cephisus and the nymph oh my word, ancient Greek, Lyriope, Liriope. If you can pronounce that, I'll give you $1. A metaphorical dollar, not a real dollar, because I'm poor. His vanity and heartlessness have made his name forever synonymous with intense self-infatuation. Self-absorption often makes compassion impossible, and vice versa. The retelling of his stories from Thomas Bulfinch's classic Age of Fable. Echo was a beautiful nymph, fond of woods and hills, where she devoted herself to woodland sports. She was a favorite of Diana and attended her in the chase. But Echo had one failing. She was fond of talking, and oh man, same. And whether in chat or argument would have the last word. One day Juno was seeking her husband, who, she had reason to fear, was amusing himself among the nymphs. Echo, by her talk, contrived to detain the goddess till the nymphs made their escape. When Juno discovered it, she passed sentence upon Echo in these words: "You shall forfeit the use of that tongue, which with you have cheated me, except for that one purpose you are so fond of. Reply. You shall still have the last word, but no power to speak first." This nymph saw Narcissus, a beautiful youth, as he pursued the chase upon the mountains. She loved him and followed his footsteps. Oh, how she longed to address him in the softest accents, and win him to converse! But it was not in her power. She waited with impatience for him to speak first, and had her answer ready. One day, the youth, being separated from his companions, shouted aloud, "Who's there?" Echo replied, "Here." Narcissus looked around, but seeing no one, called out, "Come!" Echo answered, "Come." As no one came, Narcissus called again. "Why do you shun me?" Echo asked the same question. "Let us join one another," said the youth. The maid answered with all her heart in the same words, and hastened to the spot, ready to throw her arms around his neck. He started back, exclaiming, "Hands off! I would rather die than you should have me. Have me," said she, but it was all in vain. He left her, and she went to hide her blushes in the recesses of the woods. From that time forth she lived in caves and among mountain cliffs. Her form faded with grief, till at last her flesh shrank away. Her bones were changed into rocks, and there was nothing left of her but her voice. With that she is still ready to apply to anyone who calls her, but keeps up her old habit of having the last word. Narcissus' cruelty in this case was not the only instance. He shunned all the rest of the nymphs, as he had done poor Echo. One day a maiden who had in vain endeavored to attract him uttered a prayer that he might have some time or other feel what it was to love and meet no return of affection. The avenging goddess heard and granted the prayer. There was a clear fountain, with water like silver, to which the shepherds never drove their flocks, nor the mountain goats restored, nor any of the beasts of the forest. Neither was it defaced with fallen leaves or branches, but the grass grew fresh around it, and the rock sheltered it from the sun. Hither came one day the youth, fatigued with hunting, heated and thirsty. He stooped down to drink, and saw his own image in the water. He thought it was some beautiful water spirit living in the fountain. He stood gazing with admiration at those bright eyes, those locks curled like the locks of Bacchus or Apollo, the round cheeks, the ivory neck, the parted lips, and the glow of health and exercise over all. He fell in love with himself. He brought his lips near to take a kiss. He plunged his arms in to embrace the beloved object. It fled at the touch, but returned again after a moment and renewed the fascination. He could not tear himself away. He lost all thought of food or rest, while he hovered over the brink of the fountain, gazing upon his own image. He talked with the supposed spirit. "Why, beautiful being, do you shun me? Surely my face is not one to repel you. The nymphs love me, and you yourself look not indifferent upon me. When I stretch forth my arms, you do the same, and you smile upon me, and answer my beckonings with the like." His tears fell into the water and disturbed the image. As he saw it depart, he exclaimed, "Stay, I entreat you. Let me at least gaze upon you, if I may not touch you." With this, and much more of the same kind, he cherished the flame that consumed him, so that by degrees he lost his color, his vigor, and the beauty which formerly had so charmed the nymph Echo. She kept near him, however, and when he exclaimed, "Alas! Alas!" she answered him with the same words. He pined away and died, and when his shade passed the Stygian river, it leaned over the boat to catch a look at itself in the water. The nymphs mourned for him, especially the water nymphs, and when they smote their breasts, Echo smote hers also. They prepared a funeral pyre and would have burned the body, but it was nowhere to be found. But in its place a flower purple within, and surrounded with white leaves, which bears the name and preserves itself, the memory of Narcissus. So yes, there is a flower called Narcissus, which is named after the myth. Of course, Narcissus is where we get the term narcissist from, which is to say that somebody who's overly infatuated with themselves. I had never heard the story of Echo myself, however, and how she falls in love with him, but she can't tell him that because of her curse. And then, of course, she withers away and coalesces with the mountain. It is kind of fitting that Narcissus, who's in love with his reflection, would be pined over by the girl who echoes everything that is said to her. There's sort of this theme of reflection and coming back to yourself, both from the outside and from the inside. I think it's also quite telling. It's a love triangle, but instead of being three people, it's two, and one of them is so infatuated with himself that he can't see anyone else. The thing about Greek mythology is that it's influenced more stories than we can really measure. And when you read, especially when you read Thomas Bulfinch, who doesn't just tell it, he retells it. He kind of, since he was a native English speaker, he didn't just translate. He kind of paraphrased and added his own twist, a little bit of twist to it. So it wasn't simply a retelling, but it was a little more palatable for somebody that isn't reading it in Greek. Let's see, what else? There's another story by Thomas Bulfinch here in Friendship. That one's fairly short, but I'm wondering. There's another one. Let's see which one this one is. 775. There's a lot more than Thomas Bulfinch in this book, which is why I settled on it. Okay. So this is from the Virtue of Faith, or the chapter that is about the virtue of faith. This one is called Deucalion and Pyrrha. Greek mythology describes a golden age of innocence and happiness, followed by the ages of silver, bronze, and finally iron. The latter was a savage time when crime burst in like a flood, and modesty, truth, and honor fled. War sprang up. The guest was not safe in his friend's house. Brothers and sisters, husbands and wives could not trust one another. Reverence towards the gods was neglected, and one by one they abandoned the earth. Only the piety of one couple, Deucalion and Pyrrha, saved the human race. Jupiter, seeing the wicked state of the world, burned with anger. He summoned the gods to council. They obeyed the call and took the road to the palace of heaven. The road, which anyone may see in a clear night, stretches across the face of the sky and is called the Milky Way. Along the road stand the palaces of the illustrious gods. The common people of the skies live apart, on either side. Jupiter addressed the assembly. He set forth the frightful conditions of things on the earth, and closed by announcing his intention to destroy the whole of its inhabitants, and provide a new race, unlike the first, which would be more worthy of life, and much better worshippers of the gods. So saying, he took a thunderbolt, and was about to launch it at the world, and destroy it by burning, but recollecting the danger that such a conflagration? Is that how you pronounce that? Conflagration? Might set heaven itself on fire. He changed his plan, and resolved to drown it. The north wind, which scatters the clouds, was chained up. The south was sent out, and soon covered all the face of the heaven with a cloak of pitchy darkness. The clouds, driven together, resound with a crash. Torrents of rain fall. The crops are laid low. The year's labor of the husbandman perishes in an hour. Jupiter, not satisfied with his own waters, calls on his brother Neptune to aid him with his. He lets loose the rivers, and pours them over the land. At the same time, he heaves the land with an earthquake, and brings in the reflux of the ocean over the shores. Flocks, herds, men, and houses are swept away, and temples with their sacred enclosures profaned. If any edifice remained standing, it was overwhelmed, and its turrets lay hid beneath the waves. Now all was sea without shore. Here and there an individual remained on a projecting hilltop, and few in boats pulled the oar where they had lately driven the plough. The fishes swim among the trees. The anchor is let down into a garden, where the graceful lambs played but now unwieldy sea calves gambol. The wolf swims among the sheep. The yellow lions and tigers struggle in the water. The strength of the wild boar serves him not, nor his swiftness the stag. The birds fall with weary wing into the water, having found no land for a resting place. Those living beings whom the water spared fell a prey to hunger. Parnassus alone, of all the mountains, overtopped the waves, and there Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, of the race of Prometheus, found refuge, he a just man, and she a faithful worshipper of the gods. Jupiter, when he saw none left alive but this pair, and remembered their harmless lives and pious demeanor, ordered the north winds to drive away the clouds, and disclose the skies to earth, and earth to the skies. Neptune also directed Triton to blow on his shell, and sound a retreat to the waters. The waters obeyed, and the sea returned to its shores, and the river to its channels. Then Deucalion thus addressed Pyrrha: "O wife, only surviving woman, joined to me first by the ties of kindred and marriage, and now by a common danger, would that we possessed the power of our ancestor Prometheus, and could renew the race as he had first made it. But as we cannot, let us seek yonder temple, and inquire of the gods what remains for us to do." They entered the temple, deformed as it was with slime, and approached the altar where no fire burned. There they fell prostrate upon the earth, and prayed the goddess to inform them how they might retrieve their miserable affairs. The oracle answered: "Depart from the temple with head veiled and garments unbound, and cast behind you the bones of your mother." They heard the words with astonishment. Pyrrha first broke silence. "We cannot obey. We dare not profane the remains of our parents." They sought the thickest shades of the wood, and revolved the oracle in their minds. At last Deucalion spoke: "Either my sagacity deceives me, or the command is one we may obey without impiety. The earth is the great parent of all. The stones are her bones. These we may cast behind us, and I think this is what the oracle means. At least, it will do no harm to try." They veiled their faces, unbound their garments, and picked up stones and cast them behind them. The stones, wonderful to relate, began to grow soft and assume shape. By degrees they put on a rude resemblance to the human form, like a block half finished in the hands of the sculptor. The moisture and slime that were about them became flesh. The stony part became bones. The veins remained veins, retaining their name, only changing their use. Those thrown by the hand of the man became men, and those by the woman became women. It was a hard race, and well adapted to labor, as we find ourselves to be at this day, giving plain indications of our origin. So that was that story. Hannah is asking me if I read my short story yet. I don't know which one you're referring to. I've read a few, actually. They should be... There's one... Most of the videos on the channel are streams that are archived. Those have a few short stories that I've written somewhere in there. There's one video that's not a stream. It's just an actual video, and that is a reading of my short story, which you can listen to if you'd like. But that was the last story that Thomas Bulfinch has in this book of virtues, which is about trust and how, things rebuild and all that. If I was a little more awake, I might want to talk about how there's what they call the flood myth in that story, which is to say that there's a story about a world flood or a great flood that destroys most all of everything, and then only the pious are saved. Of course, in the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they believe in the story of Noah, which is to say that God floods the earth and Noah and his family survive by having an ark and bringing all the animals on. That sort of story about a flood destroying everyone but the pious is fairly common in myth, and obviously in religion as well. So that's one example of that. I'm not smart enough to necessarily make comparisons right now because my mind is failing me. I'm not sure if Thomas Bulfinch was Christian or not. I think he was, because reading his book, like some of his introductions, he talks about how he deliberately omits some of the less savory elements of mythology, like some of the stuff that's not family friendly or that's just grotesque, which implies that he has some sort of moral standard. Anyways, very little is known about Thomas Bulfinch, so I'm not entirely sure if he was or was not religious. But it is kind of interesting to have somebody who is religious have to face that idea that something like the story of Noah's Ark, there's a lot of criticism by people outside of religion who say that that it was made up, obviously. But then there are people inside religion who believe that the story of Noah's Ark is either greatly exaggerated or that it was just a parable adapted to the religion after the fact, and that the story of a flood myth comes from other mythologies or folklores or whatever, and then it just happened to make its way into the Bible and scriptural canon. The answer to that changes based on the religion and the religious people and what have you. But anyways, there's another thing in here by Geoffrey Chaucer, who was an English writer, fairly well known. He wrote something called the Canterbury Tales, which I unfortunately don't know a lot about. I've been wondering if I should read him on here because his writing is very famous, and from what little I know about it, it is very very well written. But there is a little bit written by him in this book. And I'm going to take a look at that and see if it's worth reading. It looks like it's only 2 pages long, so maybe? Kimry saying that she read Canterbury Tales. I wish I had a chance to read it, but unfortunately in my class we just talk about language stigma and not actual literature. So that's fun. Okay, 458. That's not right. Oh, it is actually. Okay, so this is something, a story from Canterbury Tales. But it says that it's retold by J. Berg Esenwein and Marietta Stockard. Excuse me. I'm very gassy, which I know people love. This one is called Chanticleer and Partlet. It's relatively short, so I think it should be fun to check out. Hopefully you guys can hear me. That warning came back on the stream telling me that my audio bitrate is at 0. I don't know what to do about that, honestly. I think it's just a router thing. Hopefully you can hear this. If not, well, TS, I guess. So this story comes from the Nun's Priest Tale, one of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It reminds us there is such a thing as false courage, which may rise from our own vanity. There are some dangers we should rightly fear, and we shouldn't be embarrassed about a proper wariness of them. This is from the virtue of courage, of course, as opposed to the last one, which was the virtue of faith. Now, once there was a barnyard close to a wood in a little valley. Here dwelt a cock, Chanticleer by name. His comb was redder than coral, his feathers were like a burnished gold, and his voice was wonderful to hear. Long before dawn each morning his crowing sounded over the valley, and his 7 wives listened in admiration. One night, as he sat on the perch by the side of Dame Partlet, his most loved mate, he began to make a curious note in his throat. "What is it, my dear?" said Dame Partlet. "You sound frightened." "Oh," said Chanticleer, "I had the most horrible dream. I thought that as I roamed by the wood, a beast like a dog sprang out and seized me. His color was red, his nose was small, and his eyes were like coals of fire. Ugh, it was fearful." "Tut, tut! Are you a coward to be frightened by a dream? You've been eating more than was good for you. I wish my husband to be wise and brave if he would keep my love," Dame Partlet clucked, as she smoothed her feathers and slowly closed her scarlet eyes. She felt disgusted at having her sleep disturbed. Dang, dude, dump her. You've got like 6 other wives. Whatever. "Of course you are right, my love. Yet I have heard of many dreams which come true. I am sure I shall meet with some misfortune, but we shall not talk of it now. I am quite happy to be here by your side. You are very beautiful, my dear." Dame Partlet unclosed one eye slowly and made a pleased sound, deep in her throat. The next morning, Chanticleer flew down from the perch and called his hens about him for their breakfast. He walked about boldly, calling cluck, cluck, or chuck, chuck at each grain of corn which he found. He felt very proud as they all looked at him so admiringly. He strutted about in sunlight, flapping his wings to show off his feathers, and now and then throwing back his head and crowing exultantly. His dream was forgotten. There was no fear in his heart. Now, all this time, Reynard, the fox, was lying hidden in the bushes on the edges of the wood bordering the barnyard. Chanticleer walked nearer and nearer his hiding place. Suddenly he saw a butterfly in the grass, and as he stopped toward it, he spied the fox. "Cock, cock!" he cried in terror, and turned to flee. "Dear friend, why do you go?" said Reynard in his gentlest voice. "I only crept down here to hear you sing. Your voice is like an angel's. Your father and mother once visited my house. I should so love to see you there. I wondered if you remember your father's singing. I can see him now as he stood on tiptoe, stretching out his long, slender neck, sending out his glorious voice. He always flapped his wings and closed his eyes before he sang. Do you do it in the same way? Won't you sing just once and let me hear you? I am so anxious to know if you really sing better than your father." Chanticleer was so pleased with this flattery that he flapped his wings, stood up on tiptoe, shut his eyes, and crowed as loudly as he could. No sooner had he begun than Reynard sprang forward, caught him by the throat, threw him over his shoulder, and made off towards his den in the woods. The hens made a loud outcry when they saw Chanticleer being carried off, so that the people in the cottage nearby heard and ran out after the fox. The dog heard and ran yelping after him. The cow ran, the calf ran, the pigs began to squeal and run too. The ducks and geese quaked in terror and flew up into the treetops. Never was there heard such an uproar. Reynard began to feel a bit frightened himself. "How swiftly you do run," said Chanticleer from his back. "If I were you, I should have some sport out of those slow fellows who are trying to catch you. Call out to them and say, 'Why do you creep along like snails? Look, I am far ahead of you and shall soon be feasting on this cock in spite of all of you.'" Anyways, Reynard was pleased at this and opened his mouth to call to his pursuers. If only I knew it was that easy. But as soon as he did so, the cock flew away from him and perched up in a tree, safely out of reach. The fox saw he had lost his prey and began his old tricks again. I was only proving to you how important you are in the barnyard. See what a commotion we cause. I did not mean to frighten you. Come down now, and we will go along to my home. I have something very interesting to show you. No, no, said Chanticleer, you will not catch me again. A man who shuts his eyes when he ought to be looking deserves to lose his sight entirely. By this time, Chanticleer's friends were drawing near, so Reynard turned to flee. The man who talks when he should be silent deserves to lose what he has gained, he said as he sped away through the wood. So I guess that's supposed to teach us that certain fears are justifiable. I don't know. That's not really what I got out of it, but okay. I'm not going to argue with it. All right, so that is the only story by Geoffrey Chaucer in this book. I am curious to read more of Chaucer. I don't know much about him, but I've heard good things. Maybe someday. Not today, though, I don't think. Let me think. There was something I was going to look up, and now I can't remember what it was. There is a story of David and Goliath in here, which was my favorite Bible story as a kid. There's a bit of Charles Dickens, Emily Dickinson, a lot of dicks in here. Lots of cocks, too. Oh my word, there's actual Ecclesiastes in here. I'm curious about that. 103, it looks like. Yeah, so it's a bit of the poetry from the book of Ecclesiastes. I think I'll read that. It seems secular enough. So this is from the first chapter, from Self-Discipline. It's from Ecclesiastes, though it doesn't say which scripture in particular. But it's called For Everything There Is a Season. For everything there is a season, and a time for every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to cast away. A time to rend, and a time to sow. A time to keep silence, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time of war, and a time of peace. That's just a simple little exchange, telling us that there is place for just about everything in the world. There's actually quite a bit from the Bible here, which I think a lot of people do lose sight of. Not that many people have actually read the Bible, despite it being the best-selling book to ever exist, but even if you don't necessarily believe in its truth, there is a certain there is an objective truth to it in a lot of the virtues and the parables that are told. But obviously we're not going to read the whole Bible on here. Probably not even most of it. I mean, that would be funny if we did, but especially when we get to all the genealogy stuff and what's his face began what's his face and what's his face and blah blah blah. Yeah, we're not going to do that. But yeah, looking at the index, there's actually quite a bit of stuff from the Bible in here. There's the book of Daniel, Daniel in the lion's den, David and Goliath, David and Bathsheba. Let's see what else there is. Ecclesiastes, obviously. But there's also the book of Esther, which is that. Hannah's asking me if I claim the Bible to be true. It depends. Depends on the stuff that's in there. I don't necessarily believe in everything. Like the Song of Solomon, which is a lesser-known book in there. I don't believe that that's scripturally important. And I believe that the book of Job is a parable, not an actual person. But there's stuff from the book of Exodus and the book of Ezra in here. Oh, there's William Faulkner in here. I think my boss was asking me about him the other day. I think he was just trying to mess with me. He's like, is William Faulkner your favorite author? I was like, I don't know. I've never read him. I don't think he has either. I think he was just trying to mess with me. Something called I declined to accept the end of man. Sounds a little serious. I don't know if I want to read it. There's something in here called laconic answer. Laconic, that's a little bit of interesting trivia. So we have a phrase in English. We say that something is laconic, which means that it's kind of a very brief and to the point, but also witty, typically. At least that's the idea. I just belched. Now, the word laconic comes from Greek. In particular, the kingdom of Sparta was located in the Greek province of Laconia. Laconia, so the Spartans were infamous for their laconic nature, which is where we get the word. And because they were very witty and they were very to the point, at least while they survived. Ultimately, they met their end because they were idiots, but you know, sic semper. But the movie from years and years ago, which was one of the probably the first rated R movie I saw in theaters, was 300. And in that movie, there's a lot of those cheesy action one-liners like, "Our arrows will blot out the sun," and then the Spartan's like, "Then we will fight in the shade." Well, that's an actual historical line. The context was different. It wasn't the crazy slow motion action that happened in the movie. But essentially, yeah, that was literally the Spartan response to being challenged. They were told that their enemy's arrows would blot out the sun. They're like, all right, we'll fight in the shade. In fact, I'm going to look that up real quick because there was a lot of stuff like that. Or like the line, "Tonight we dine in hell." The Spartans, what they said was, "Tonight we dine in Hades," because they just weren't afraid of that. Let me see. I'm just looking up quotes real quick if I can remember some of it. Man, there's a lot of repeats. Mostly it's that one of "we will fight in the shade." I remember the movie fairly well, actually. So, okay. So this is a really good one from the Wikipedia article on laconic phrase. A prominent example of laconic phrase involves Philip II of Macedon. After invading southern Greece and receiving the submission of other key city-states, he turned his attention to Sparta and asked menacingly whether he should come as friend or foe. The reply was neither. That's all they said. They didn't say don't come, they just said neither, which, of course, is a lot wittier. And I don't remember who it was, but somebody once said brevity is the soul of wit. Well, you can see that definitely in the Spartans. So after receiving that curt message, he sent another one. He said, "You are advised to submit without further delay. For if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city." Spartan Ephors again replied with a single word: "If." Subsequently, neither Philip nor his son, Alexander the Great, attempted to capture the city. Let's see here. Now, the movie 300 takes some quotes from different areas and applies them to the movie anachronistically. But the movie stars, or rather, it centers around King Leonidas for his battle with the Persians at Thermopylae, which was a thing that actually happened. And his queen, Gorgo of Sparta, asked what she should do, and he said, "Marry a good man and bear good children," which was a line in the movie. But he really, it's recorded that he really did say that. I thought there were more examples, but maybe not. I guess the most prominent one is definitely "We will fight in the shade." which is definitely one of the more BA quotes. Anyways, so that's a little tidbit about the Spartans. And now we've got this thing here in the Book of Virtues, in the chapter on courage, the virtue of courage, called A Laconic Answer. This story, another famous anecdote from the Spartans' bravery, is from the time of Philip... Oh, my word, that might actually be... Yup. That's the long version of that story I just told, so never mind. Let's see what else we've got in this one. There is Les Miserables, or a section from it. I don't know if I want to read that, though. I know that that book is a little long-winded. There's quite a bit of in here from Abraham Lincoln. Maybe I'll read a bit of Aesop, though. Aesop? I think I've talked about him on stream before, but he, of course, created or compiled some of the most well-known fables in the world. And there's a number of them in this book, and they're all really small, really short little anecdotes. $110. Here's one that I like. It's The Lion and the Mouse. Here's one of the oldest and best loved stories of kindness, paid and repaid. From it we learn that compassion lies within the power of both the mighty and the meek. Kindness is not a feeble virtue. One day, a great lion lay asleep in the sunshine. A little mouse ran across his paw and wakened him. The great lion was just going to eat him up when the little mouse cried, "Oh, please, let me go, sir. Someday I may help you." The lion laughed at the thought that the little mouse could be of any use to him, but he was a good-natured lion, and he set the mouse free. Not long after, the lion was caught in a net. He tugged and pulled with all his might, but the ropes were too strong. Then he roared loudly. The little mouse heard him and ran to the spot. "Be still, dear lion, and I will set you free. I will gnaw at the ropes." With his sharp little teeth, the mouse cut the ropes, and the lion came out of the net. "You laughed at me once," said the mouse. "You thought I was too little to do you a good turn. But see, you owe your life to a poor little mouse." I don't know I can't remember which of his stories that I read. I don't think I read very many of them. But there was that one. That was a little different than what I was remembering. But that's okay, because it's still good. You gotta appreciate the short stories, you know, because it's much trickier to be witty in a few words than it is to be smart in many of them. Here's a little poem by Robert Frost included in the book. This is from the chapter of Friendship. This little poem reminds us that a friend is someone we want to be with. It's called The Pasture by Robert Frost. I'm going out to clean the pasture spring. I'll only stop to rake the leaves away, and wait to watch the water clear I may. I shan't be gone long, you come too. I'm going out to fetch the little calf that's standing by the mother. It's so young, it totters when she licks it with her tongue. I shan't be gone long, you come too. Maybe I'm a fool, but if I'm being honest, I don't always understand Robert Frost, and this is one instance of that. Poetry is not my strong point, but that's okay. Sometimes it's nice to just have a little story to listen to. There's more of Aesop, 359. This is another short one. Hercules and the Wagoner. Some people exhibit an almost miraculous resolve in waiting for someone else to come along and do their work for them. This old fable may help us learn early that the only certain labor is your own. A wagoner was driving his team along a muddy lane with a full load behind them. when the wheels of his wagon sank so deep in the mire that no efforts of his horses could move them. As he stood there, looking helplessly on, and calling loudly at intervals upon Hercules for assistance, the god himself appeared, and said to him, "Put your shoulders to the wheel, man, and goad on your horses. Then you may call on Hercules to assist you. If you won't lift a finger to help yourself, you can't expect Hercules or anyone else to come to your aid." The moral of the story being heaven helps those who help themselves. Obviously, I want to keep this stream fairly secular, but I'll say, that as a person who believes in God, I certainly feel that certainly you do have to do what you can, obviously, and then the rest relies upon God and His wisdom for you. Oh my word! Speaking of religion, the next short story immediately after one is written by Laura E. Richards. That's kind of funny. Most of you who are listening to this probably don't understand, but I was talking about David Jones earlier, and he was in my ward, which is to say that he and I would go to church at the same time. And another person in our ward is Laura Richards. So that's kind of funny. Small world, I guess. She actually got released as a ward missionary, and I haven't seen her since, which is kind of interesting. Hopefully she's doing all right. But she's kind of like David Jones. She's very mousy, very quiet. Real sweet girl, though. Real sweet. There's also 388 here. That's another Aesop fable. The bundle of sticks. Yeah, we're not going to touch that one. Not on my Christian Minecraft server. Shelby is saying she's taken a lot of classes, so she must be swamped with schoolwork. That would explain it. She's always a bright soul, though. She never seems to be down in the dumps, which is I mean, what can you say, really? She's a light, to be sure. There's also stuff in here by Hans Christian Andersen, who's another fable fantasy writer. Maybe I could even talk about him at some point. Oh, you know what? According to this thing, he wrote The Little Match Girl. There's that really sad story about a little girl that dies selling matches. So that's fun. Let's see here. He also wrote a story, I think it was called... I think you and Amber terrify everyone, Shelby. Anyways, thanks for coming on the stream. Oh, he did write The Emperor's New Clothes. It's kind of a long one, but it is a very good story. You're welcome, Shelby. The Emperor's New Clothes. Before I got into that, though, I was thinking about the other Hans Christian Andersen story. I don't remember what it's called. Ah, jeez. Anyways, it's this story about this. I have met Amber. Shelby is asking me. Yeah, I have met Amber. I think she was at your birthday party, that little shindig that we had. I remember especially because she asked Missy what her name was, and this was in the middle of things, so we were all just high on life or whatever. And when she found out that Missy's name was Missy, Amber for some reason just burst out laughing, to the point where she just had to sit down. She just she was laughing so hard she could not stand, which is always fun. Just for no reason. She just thought the fact that her name was Missy was so funny. Anyways. But Hans Christian Andersen, he wrote a story. I don't even remember what it's called, like I said, but it starts off with a story about these demons that forge a mirror, but the mirror is cursed so that anyone that looks at it only sees their flaws. And so they go around messing with people by showing them their flaws and breaking their hearts. And so at one point they get the bright idea that they're going to go take it up to heaven and show it to God. And then so they start to take it, but as they do, the mirror starts to laugh and shake. And the further up they go, the more it laughs and shakes until it finally like slips out of their hand, falls to the earth and shatters. And all the cursed pieces of this mirror fly into like people's eyes and make it so that they can only see the flaws in the people that they see. I don't remember the moral of that story, but it was an interesting story. But Hans Christian Andersen, he's another prominent fantasy author. You could say that he's more of a folklorist or a fairy tale sort of person, but all that is definitely tied to fantasy and genre fiction, even if it's not what we consider to be fantasy and genre fiction. Anyway, semantics are dumb. I'm gonna read The Emperor's New Clothes though, because this is a very interesting story. Many years ago, there was an emperor who was so fond of new clothes that he spent all of his money on them. He did not give himself any concern about his army. He cared nothing about the theater or for driving about in the woods, except for the sake of showing himself off in new clothes. He had a costume for every hour in the day, and just as they say of a king or emperor, he is in his council chamber, they said of him, the emperor is in his dressing room. Life was merry and gay in the town where the emperor lived. Yeah, I would bet. If your emperor is obsessed with clothes, he's definitely gay. And numbers of strangers came into it every day. Among them there came one day 2 rascals, who gave themselves out as weavers and said that they knew how to weave the most expensive stuff imaginable. Not only were the colors and patterns uncommonly beautiful, but the clothes that were made of the stuff had the particular property of being invisible to every person who was unfit for the office he held or who was exceptionally stupid. Those must be valuable clothes, thought the emperor. By wearing them, I should be able to discover which of the men in my empire are not fit for their posts. I should distinguish wise men from fools. Yes, I must order some of the stuff to be woven for me directly. And he paid the swindlers a handsome sum of money in advance, as they required. As for them, they put up 2 looms and pretended to be weaving, though there was nothing whatsoever on their spindles. They called for the quantity of the finest silk and of the purest gold thread, all of which they went into their bags, while they worked at their empty looms till late into the night. I should like to know how those weavers are getting on with this stuff, thought the emperor. But he felt a little queer. Come on. He felt a little queer when he reflected that those who were stupid or unfit for their office would not be able to see the material. He believed, indeed, that he had nothing to fear for himself, but still he thought it better to send someone else first, to see how the work was coming on. All the people in the town had heard of the peculiar property of the stuff, and everyone was curious to see how stupid his neighbor might be. I will send my faithful old prime minister to the weavers, thought the emperor. He will be the best capable of judging the stuff, for he is a man of sense, and nobody is more fit for his office than he. So the worthy old minister went into the rooms where the 2 swindlers sat working on the empty looms. Heaven save us, thought the old man, opening his wide eyes. Why, I can't see a thing at all. But he took care not to say so out loud. Both the rogues begged him to step a little nearer, and asked him if he did not think the patterns very pretty and the coloring fine. They pointed to the empty loom as they did so, and the poor old minister kept staring as hard as he could, without being able to see anything for it. For, of course, there was nothing there to see. Heaven save us, thought the old man. Is it possible that I am a fool? I never have thought it, and nobody must know it. Is it true that I am not fit for my office? It will never do for me to say that I cannot see the stuff. Well, sir, do you say nothing about the cloth? Asked the one who was pretending to go about his work. Oh, it is most elegant, most beautiful, said the dazed old man as he peered again through his spectacles. What a fine pattern, and what fine colors! I will certainly tell the emperor how pleased I am with the stuff. We are glad of that, said both the weavers, and then they named the pattern, the colors, and pointed out the special features of the pattern. To all of this the minister paid great attention, so that he might be able to repeat it to the emperor when he went back to him. Now the cheats called for more money, more silk, and more gold thread, to be able to process with the weaving, but they put it all into their own pockets, and not a thread went into the stuff, though they went on as before, weaving at the empty looms. After a little time, the emperor sent another honest statesman to see how the weaving was progressing, and if the stuff would soon be ready. The same thing happened with him as with the minister. He gazed and gazed, but as there was nothing but empty looms, he could see nothing else. "Is not this an exquisite piece of stuff?" he asked the weavers, pointing out to one of the looms and explaining the beautiful patterns and the colors which were not there to be seen. "I am not stupid, I know I am not," thought the man, "so it must be that I am not fit for my good office. It is very strange, but I must not let it be noticed." So he praised the cloth he did not see and assured the weavers of his delight in the lovely colors and the exquisite pattern. "It is perfectly charming," he reported to the emperor. Everybody in the town was talking of the splendid cloth. The emperor thought he should like to see it himself while it was still on the loom. With a company of carefully selected men, among whom were the two worthy officials who had been there before, he went to visit the crafty impostors, who were working as hard as ever at the empty looms. "Is it not magnificent?" said both the honest statesmen. "See, your majesty, what splendid colors, and what a pattern!" And they pointed to the looms, for they believed that others, no doubt, could see what they did not. "What!" thought the emperor, "I see nothing at all! This is terrible! Am I a fool? Am I not fit to be emperor? Why, nothing more dreadful could happen to me." "Oh, it is very pretty! It has my highest approval," the emperor said aloud. He nodded with satisfaction as he gazed at the empty looms, for he could not betray that he could see nothing. His whole court gazed and gazed, and each seeing no more than the others, but like the emperor, they all exclaimed, "Oh, it is beautiful!" They even suggested to the emperor that he wear the splendid new clothes for the first time on the occasion of a great procession which was soon to take place. "Splendid, glorious, magnificent!" went from mouth to mouth. All were equally delighted with the weaver's workmanship. The emperor gave each of the impostors an order of knighthood to be sworn in their buttonholes, and the title gentleman weaver of the imperial court. But the day on which the procession was to take place, the weavers sat up the whole night, burning 16 candles, so that people might see how anxious they were to get the new emperor's new clothes ready. They pretended to take the stuff from the loom. They cut it out in the air with huge scissors, and they stitched away with needles that had no thread in them. At last they said, "Now the clothes are finished." The emperor came to them himself with his grandest courtiers, and each of the rogues lifted his arm as if he held something, saying, "See, here are the trousers, and here is the coat, here is the cloak," and so on. "It is as light as a spider's web. One would almost feel as if one had nothing on. That is the beauty of it." "Yes," said all the courtiers, but they saw nothing, for there was nothing to see. "Will your majesty be graciously pleased to take off your clothes, so that we may put on the new clothes here, before the great mirror?" The emperor took off his clothes, and the rogues pretended to put on first one garment, then the other, of the new ones they pretended to make. They pretended to fasten something round his waist, and to tie something on. This, they said, was the train, and the emperor turned around and round in the mirror. "How well his majesty looks in the new clothes! How becoming they are!" cried all the courtiers in turn. "What a splendid costume!" "The canopy that is to be carried over your majesty in the procession is waiting outside," said the master of ceremonies. "Well, I am ready," replied the emperor. "Don't the clothes look well?" And he turned round and round again before the mirror, to appear as if he were admiring his new costume. The chamberlains, who were to carry the train, stopped and put their hands near the floor as if they were lifting it. Then they pretended to be holding something in the air. They would not let it be noticed that they could see and feel nothing. So the emperor went along in the procession under the splendid canopy, and everyone in the streets said, "How beautiful the emperor's new clothes are! What a splendid train, and how well they fit!" No one wanted to let it appear that he could see nothing, for that would prove him not fit for his post. None of the emperor's clothes had been so great a success before. "But he has nothing on," said a little child. "Just listen to the innocent," said the father, and one person whispered to another what the child said. "He has nothing on. The child says he has nothing on." "But he has nothing on," cried all the people. The emperor was startled by this, for he had a suspicion they were right, but he thought, "I must face this out to the end and go on with the procession." So he held himself more stiffly than ever. Gross. And the chamberlain held up the train that was not there at all. And that's the emperor's new clothes. It's kind of a weird story, of course. But I don't know a whole lot about this, unfortunately. I almost hate to admit it. I believe it's about what they call the social contract. which I believe is sort of the societal agreement between people, where they they agree with one another, even if it doesn't necessarily always make sense. And it's better to keep the peace than to cause trouble. There's also a little bit of sunken cost fallacy in there, which is to say that even though things seem bad, you'll still keep going along with it because you don't want to admit that you were wrong. There's another aspect to it, which George R.R. Martin expressed really well in A Song of Ice and Fire. He gave a little parable about a knight who was surrounded by three people. One of them was the king, the other was the high priest of the land, and the third was the wealthiest person in all the land. The king says to him, "Slay these other two men, and I will grant to you all the land and titles that you so desire." The high priest says to him, "Slay the king and the rich man, and I will grant to you favor with the gods." And the rich man says, "Slay the king and the pious man, and instead I will give you all the wealth you desire, which is more than the king can offer you." And so George R.R. Martin asks in the story, he says, who does the knight go with? Does he go with the king for the land and the glory? Does he go with the high priest for the favor with the gods? Or does he go with with wealth? And it's just a conundrum. There's no real answer. The answer is that he could pick any of them. The answer is that power resides where we believe it resides. That if a person decides to hold religion to the summum bonum, which is the greatest good, then they will choose the high priest. If a person decides that glory is the greatest prize, then they will slay the other two. If a person decides that they want wealth beyond measure, then they will slay the king and the priest. The point being that people decide where power resides. And so there's this sort of this closed loop, you might call it, sort of a paradox, where we assume people have power and that gives them power, and then because they have power, we assume they have power. And I was actually thinking about this earlier. So there was a game a couple years back. It was called Hatred, and it was this game about about spree shootings, and this was before the whole mass shootings things really started to happen basically every day or every week or whatever it was, when it was still sort of a lot less common. Or perhaps it'd be better to say when it was not in the news as often. Anyways, so this game Hatred, it's not like there's no goodness to the story. It's complete nihilism, just total edgelord. I'm going to kill everyone. And that's the point of the game, is that you go around shooting innocent people, and you're just this complete psychopath that just wants to kill as many people as you can. And I was kind of thinking about it, and I know that and when I was watching somebody who kind of did a review of it and was talking about it a little bit, and he kind of briefly mentioned that the developers were like, if you sympathize with this guy, then you're a bad person or whatever. And I was just thinking, I was like, that is terrible satire. Like, it's so lazy when anyone says that, oh no, it's not bad, it's just satire. It happens a lot with terrible writers who want to defend their terrible schlock and say that it's actually good when it's not. You're just trying to save face. But anyways, the point I wanted to bring that up is I was thinking about it because something that happens with that story, with that game, is that it was kind of this really obscure title by this Polish developers. I think they were either Polish or Ukrainian. Just a really small game. It's only like 3 hours long or so, which is really short for a video game, obviously. And it wasn't very well known until it became controversial, until people started to raise a fuss about it. And it got pulled from the Steam store, which obviously sells games and whatnot. It got pulled from the Steam store, which basically never happens, especially not now. But it got pulled, and people raised a fuss. They're like, oh, they shouldn't, censor people. They should let them, do this and that. And it's like, it's no worse than any of the other games that are on Steam. So Steam relented and were like, all right, we'll put it back on. And I guess Gabe Newell, the president of Valve, actually sent a letter personally to the developers apologizing for pulling their game. At least that was what I heard. But anyways, so I was looking at that and all that, all the trying to save face of, oh no, it's satire and all this stuff. And I was trying to decide like if it really was satire, because anyone can just say that, and 9 times out of 10 it's complete BS, or if it's not BS, it's just terrible satire. Um, but in this instance, even though I don't believe that they intended for it to be satire, I think it was just them trying to be edgy and make a splash and whatnot. I thought about it and I was thinking, if it hadn't been for that controversy, nobody would have ever heard of that game. Like if people hadn't raised a stink about it, it would have just dwindled in obscurity and nobody would have cared. And so I thought about it, and I thought like because in the years following that, there were other controversies. Obviously, there were a lot more spree shootings and that sort of thing. But I also felt like with a lot of those spree shootings and mass shootings and all that, I feel like a lot of it was honestly, I mean, obviously, people that go on spree shootings, like there's no, I mean, something has to be really broken in you to do that, to even think to do that. But beyond that, I felt like a lot of it was caused by hysteria. I felt like that a lot of it was caused by news outlets and concerned moms and all these people crying and just being so horrified and making such a big deal. Well, that makes it sound like I'm diminishing the seriousness of it, but they were sensationalizing it. And like you can't tell, like if there's a mass shooting, you can't tell someone like don't sensationalize it, because it's like it's a big deal, 10, 20, 30, sometimes 50 people have just died. You can't just tell people that you're not allowed to make a big deal out of that, because that is a big deal. But the point being was that because they did sensationalize it and because it was all over the news, I felt like that was a big reason why people kept doing it. There was this guy a few years back called Elliot Rodger who went on a small shooting spree, and he was he was known because he had a manifesto for it, and he published that on the internet where he kind of talked about how he was frustrated with life and everything that was going on, and so he wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, if you can call it that. And the thing is that like people did pick up on that, because there are people who talk about Elliot Rodger as sort of like a sort of a patron saint, and like again, you could say, well, it's just satire. It's complete BS. Even if it's satire, it's not good satire. And for whatever it's worth, I don't believe that it's satire. I believe that it's just a bunch of frustrated people that are mentally ill and mentally broken, trying to retain some semblance of pride in the only nihilistic way that they know how. And it happens, like the same thing with the Columbine shooters. People idolize the Columbine shooters and the Virginia Tech shooter from years and years ago. People idolize these assholes and they hold them up to a pedestal. And when the news sensationalizes these mass shootings, that kind of justifies it for them in their broken eyes, in their broken minds. Because they're like, oh, if I do this, not only is my misery going to end, I'm going to take all these assholes with me, but people are going to talk about me and they're going to give me all this attention and, all this sort of thing. And I'm going to break all these hearts and make all these people suffer. And, I mean, there's no word to say just how awful that absolutely is. But my point is that sensationalism in somebody who is capable of going on a shooting spree, that to them, that sensationalism is really tempting. And so the fact that there was so much so much coverage over it and like just so focused on it, Like, I honestly feel like that was a big reason why there were so many, is because they were just getting coverage, and these people just saw, well, I could not only, kill all these people, but people will be talking about me, and I'll leave a lasting legacy. And I'm not saying it makes sense, but I'm saying that that's what people were thinking. And I will give Hatred credit for one thing, Hatred the game, that is, because it would have faded if it hadn't been sensationalized. If there had not been a controversy, nobody would have cared. Like 100 people would have bought it on Steam, and then they would have just been like, "Yeah, this game's okay," and that's it. Instead, what happened is people got scared, they got angry, and they pulled it from Steam, and they started talking about it, and that got them a lot of coverage, like more marketing than money can buy. And because of that, they made a lot of money on this stupid little game that would have otherwise faded into obscurity. And so that in and of itself, I think, is a microcosm, a demonstration of the spree shooter mentality. Looking at Steam, there's almost 6,000 reviews for the game in total since it launched back in 2015. And surprisingly, it seems like there actually is updates for the game still. But that small little team that made this 6-hour game suddenly made so much money that they didn't, and they didn't even have to pay for any of that publicity or attention or anything like that. And so I'm not going to pretend that it was necessarily intentional, at least not from the beginning. It's certainly possible that the developers played it up and deliberately wanted people to be angry and talking about it, because that would get them the attention they needed and make them more money without them having to spend a dime. And I'm going to say that the same is true for most spree shooters, that they see that all they have to do is this, shoot a couple people, and suddenly their name is in the news. So I'll say that about Hatred, is that it does seem to demonstrate that Streisand effect that spree shooters seem to have. Anyways, that's horribly depressing. But I guess if there's any lesson to be learned from that in particular, and as far as the Emperor's New Clothes are concerned, is if you let fear dictate your life, you make yourself a fool. And that was what was happening in the Emperor's New Clothes. Was nobody wanted to correct the Emperor because they didn't want to seem foolish. They didn't want to lose their job. And so they all went along with the lie, and they all played into it and fed into it until the very end. And the only time, and the only reason that they changed their minds was because an innocent child whose view of the world was pure and unadulterated, literally unadulterated, um, had the audacity that children have to just say the truth and say, that guy's not wearing any clothes. So if you give yourself into fear, you make yourself a fool. And unfortunately, in terms of spree shooters and giving it attention, I feel like that definitely makes it worse. And thankfully, it seems like it's not nearly as common as it was, or at least it's not as sensationalized as it was, which is great. But if we're going to combat the evils of the world, what we need to do is not let fear dictate our actions. And when we see a naked guy parading around the streets, we need to be like, that dude is naked, and not say, oh, he's definitely wearing clothes, and get on with our lives for fear of appearing foolish. So anyways, yeah, welcome to the stream where we talk about naked guys and make fun of gay people, apparently, and talk about mass shootings. That's the kind of stream that we wanted. But anyways, that's going to be it for me tonight. We've been streaming for over 2 hours now. Thank you all for your patience, for all the technical difficulties, and for listening to me ramble about whatever it is I was talking about. I don't know if Joe is still on the stream, but thanks for coming by. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all that other jazz. Do this stream every Sunday, or try to at least. We do it at about 8 p.m. Pacific time. We try to find new things to talk about, not just in terms of fiction, but also in terms of psychology and sociology and social implications. Although most of the time it's me complaining about life. But hey, it's going to be one or the other, right? Anyways, thanks for coming on, guys. Good night.